a very, very quick survey. Who of you think that it's a good idea to labelize the figure of cluster manager? Cluster management, not manager. Cluster management. Who are in favor of it? Formalizing it. Who are against? Well, and neutral, the rest of you. So really there are some, the first question is for Emiliano. Emiliano, you know perfectly how it's going, you are involved in the project of Cluster Excellence in Europe. How do you think this project is going to address the problems that have come up here and that have come up in the tables?
Well, you put it difficult if you put first this question, but I think if we need to develop knowledge materials to help cluster managers improve, we need to put a standard first. You know, it's very difficult to know what are we trying to train you for if we don't put a standard. So a standard does not mean that this is going to be a label. It is voluntary to get this label, but we need to define what do you need to know. If imagine we are going to design, imagine like an MBA before the MBAs existed. Before the MBAs existed, we needed to know what a manager needs. It's only 100 years old that the business schools exist. So 100 years ago, the people, they say, what does a manager needs to know? He needs to know about finance, he needs to know about project management, he needs to know about human resources. So at one point, we need to do this exercise for cluster management. And again, cluster managers, an MBA, people then takes different skills. There will be one course, and then somebody will go into the finance side, somebody will go on the operations side, somebody in the marketing side. But this is an exercise that this project is going to have to do, and the project will start by defining some kind of label, some kind of level first, of standards. And the application of that label is something that's going to take much longer, and it will be a decision of every one of you. But we need to start with defining what is it needed. And then we will provide the materials for that. And what I think is quite obvious from what we have been discussed today is that these materials, everybody will have to adapt it to themselves. If somebody that comes from business probably will not look so much at the strategy issues and things like have to do with marketing. But if somebody that comes from government, his previous periods have been in government or in academia, I have cluster managers who are in the food cluster and they were food scientists. They know a lot about bacteria, but they know anything about marketing. So those people will need to take some of those materials and then customize it to them. So I think that the project, what tries to do is to set what kind of the overall skills that are necessary, and that at one point or another we have to make a point. The MBA courses are evolving, and in the past they didn't have so much entrepreneurship, but today they have more entrepreneurship. This will be the same. At one point, today we'll try to do the best we can in defining what are the skills that cluster management needs to have. And then try to build with the contributions from case studies, from best practices in Europe and other places, what are people which have achieved these things properly. And from then on, it will be up to every one of you then to take this back to your organizations, to your countries, and then to customize it to your particular profiles. So I think that's what you have to see. And the Club of Cluster Managers, which is an integral part of this project, also will have an important role in the promotion of this and explaining this, on helping people to customize, to build up this profession. That's what we're trying to say. I don't know if this clarifies.
Not elitist, but open, of course, this club.
Well, if you are not elitist, it's never going to work. In the sense, the purpose of this is cluster excellence. Elitism doesn't mean excellence. Excellence means doing the things properly, and that doesn't mean it's only for good. There are no good or bad clusters. There will be good or bad management, and there will be, ideally, people will build a reputation. These guys that are running this are good managers, and they did a very good job with those clusters. I'm sure now one of our partners is Clusterland Upper Austria. We know it's a very good organization. So if there was a market for cluster managers, it would be these people having worked in that will be recognized and will get a market recognition. That's kind of things that should happen in the future. Right now, I think we have to make a criteria of which one of you is a good cluster manager and put your salaries in function of that. It's very difficult to do it from the outside. There's no clear pattern or rule. I hope that this will develop. So it doesn't have to be elitist, it has to be open, but the purpose is to differentiate good from bad, excellence from not excellence.
Okay. Yesterday I heard, well, there are some successful clusters in Europe without the figure of a cluster manager. So can it be? What's your opinion, Claire?
I studied originally in the cluster in Cambridge, and that is an example of an extremely spontaneous biotechnology cluster. It was around before they decided to invent biotechnology as a term, and it continues now. There is no strategic policy within the region towards it. There's no specific financial help, but the cluster continues. But it was very fortunate that this was the case. I think people were in the right place at the right time, and at a time when a lot of money was being put on the table for biotechnology. The Cambridge model is not replicable across Europe, particularly now, where there is a great need for early stage biotechnology funding and no commercial, no private funding there to step into the gap anymore. So it is very, very difficult. I find clusters being manufactured artificially that will not survive beyond when the public money runs out. And the question I would have to ask is it worth putting their money into those at all? It should be, in many ways, it should be like the biotech sector itself. You put the money in where you know it is going to create the maximum return. Not every region needs a cluster in every single sector. They are not sustainable in many places. It has to be a much wiser approach to where the money is targeted, to where that money is actually going to get a return.
I agree. Michel, I think cluster managers are like good decathlon athletes. No, probably there's no one person that can do all, but probably a team. What do you think? Not about the idea of this Superman, but the idea of who is supporting him or her. The idea, your word, your neologism, the clusterpreneur, these people inside the companies that are really supporting the whole process. Do you think it's an important figure, apart from the cluster manager, these clusterpreneurs?
Yes, I discovered many thanks for the question. I discovered the wording. I spoke this morning on the kind of a hub. The cluster managers now function of a hub because clusters drive research, development, innovation, in new scheme, in new approach, and I completely agree with this kind of new idea that we need to have a kind of specialist, which is a kind of generalist of a lot of technologies, of a lot of specialities from research, from innovation, from tax and legal mechanisms. So really, as far as we are involved as a policy maker or public agency, we need to think of this kind of approach, moving from support individual people from in companies, moving towards the support of this kind of approach. And I'm quite interested within the structural funds approach towards mobility. We all spoke of mobility of people from companies towards large companies, large group or universities, but that could be an approach developed within cluster for the benefit of clusters management. And I believe that the pilot initiatives developed within Sweden and Denmark, ambassador, I believe is the wording, and in French it's ambassador program. I believe this kind of initiatives could be usefully developed or followed in order to really assess their impact.